The captain continued to try to get back onto the profile, but he was still not using his speed brakes. Instead, he switched over the autopilot to vertical speed mode and increased that to 2,400 feet per minute. At the same time, he decreased the speed selected to 280 knots, but since the aircraft in vertical speed mode will prioritize the vertical speed, as the name suggests, the speed just kept increasing to 317 knots. Now, below 10,000 feet, the speed restriction in almost all places is 250 knots, and that was also the SOP in ACT Airlines. But the captain now told the first officer that he would disregard this and maintain high speed below 10,000 feet instead, at least to start with. Now, in controlled airspace, you can get ATC approval to do this, and it's not a big deal. But in this case, it was a sign that the aircraft was not in a good energy state, and this would become a bigger and bigger problem as they now started to get closer and closer to the approach. So, what could they have done instead? Well, here there are several ways to deal with this. Like I mentioned before, early use of speed brakes and high speed can often help if you are far out. But as you're starting to get closer to the approach, you often have to do the complete opposite, which is to slow the aircraft right down. Now, if you do that, it will momentarily put you even higher above the profile, but it will also enable you to select flaps and even possibly extend the landing gear to increase the overall drag, even though using the landing gear is a bit extreme.
从3万的本金滚到现在有上亿的身价，靠了自己的心法，然后创出一个投资数，可以说是比散户还要傻。
靠一招不死本投资数连赚55年，重复在200万元，迄今身家破亿。光靠操作除权息股票，就可以赚的全年生活费，成为平民。
But with flaps and speed brake selected at a lower speed, your vertical speed might not be as high, but your descent per nautical mile will be higher, which is actually what you need as you're getting closer. Now, after you have tried this, if you still see that it's not enough, well, then the only right thing to do is request a holding pattern or delaying vectors. That might feel irritating and delay you a few minutes, but it's always worth it, trust me. But these two pilots instead kept pressing on, and as they passed 12,200 feet, the captain finally started extending his speed brakes. About 1 minute later, 250 knots was also selected on the MCP, and the descent mode went back into level change. This meant that the aircraft now started reducing the speed after all, but by doing that, it also reduced its vertical speed. At this point, the approach controller called them up with a weather update for the crew. The RVR had now dropped to 300 meters in the touchdown zone, which was less than the 350 meters they needed, but they were still allowed to start the approach and continue down to 1,000 feet, hoping that the RVR would improve, and if not, obviously they would then have to do a go-around. Now, this provision meant that when the approach controller asked them if they were still happy to continue, they answered that they were. If they would have taken the decision to go into a halt here instead, this story would have had a very different ending. At time 01:11 and 18 seconds, the aircraft passed the Tokpa point at an altitude of 9,200 feet. That's 3,200 feet higher than the captain had planned with. A few seconds later, an autopilot caution annunciation was triggered. Now, this had to do with a temporary trimming issue in one of the flight control computers, and it quickly disappeared, but it was never called out by any of the crew. This fault will have no bearing on what's about to happen, but the fact that it wasn't noticed or called out by the crew also might be a sign that the pilots were starting to get a little bit distracted. The controller now cleared the crew for the ILS approach and asked them to report when established on the localizer. He also told them that the transition level was flight level 60, and below that they would need to fly at an altimeter setting of QNH 1023 Pascal. This was read back by the first officer, and the altimeters were then changed over by both pilots. They were still at 8,300 feet at this point, with only 12.5 nautical miles to go. That's about half the track miles that you would really need, so the situation was starting to get really bad. The speed had now reduced back to 250 knots, so the captain called for flaps 1 to be selected. He then reduced the speed further to 240 knots and asked for flaps 5, and this was a really reasonable thing to do, like I explained before. He told the first officer to request further descent, and when he did, they were told to descend to 3,400 feet, which was the lowest altitude that they could get before capturing the glide slope. The captain selected that new altitude on the mode control panel, and he then asked the first officer to start running through the approach checklist. At times 01:13 and 28 seconds, the aircraft flew past a guide point located on the radial 090 degrees and 8 nautical miles away from Manas VR. This point was the last point on the arrival before turning in towards the localizer, and it was designed to be passed at a minimum of 4,400 feet. The aircraft passed that point at 6,500 feet, a full 2,100 feet higher than the minimum, and with a speed of 220 knots. The captain asked for flaps 10 to be selected, and when the first officer reached over to select it, he also said, "Speed checks, flaps 10, we might end up a bit high here, and we have speed as well," clearly showing some discomfort with the situation. The captain did not respond to this prompt by the first officer, and the first officer didn't mention his concerns anymore after this. The aircraft now continued towards the localizer, and the captain kept the speed brakes extended, even though that was not recommended above flaps 5 to avoid buffeting. This shows that the captain likely was well aware of the problematic height, but he still did not extend the landing gear, which could have possibly helped here. Instead, he armed the localizer mode, making the autopilot ready to capture it, and at times 01:14 and 5 seconds, the localizer beam was indeed captured and the aircraft started turning towards the runway. They were now only 6.1 nautical miles away from the touchdown, with an altitude around 5,700 feet and a speed of 200 knots, still desperately high. The first officer called out, "Localizer captured," to which the captain responded, "Approach mode selected." This meant that the autopilot would now be primed to capture the glide slope as well, but the problem was that the 3 degrees glide slope that they were actually aiming for was now situated well below them. Now, it is possible to capture a glide slope from above, but you have to be very careful if you're going to do that. Because of the nature of how radio signals are transmitted, they will often bounce against the ground as well as being transmitted in the intended direction, and this will create false glide slopes at regular intervals. The most common ones are set at 6 and 9 degrees from the transmitter, stretching above the correct glide slope, and the autopilot will not be able to distinguish between the correct glide slope and a false one. Because of that, we normally never arm the approach mode unless we are capturing the glide slope from below or we are within 1 dot of the glide slope from above and the altitude makes sense. Anyway, the aircraft was now barreling forward towards the runway, still well above the glide. The autopilot was operating with the localizer captured, giving it lateral guidance and level change, descending it down to 3,400 feet as cleared. When they passed 5.4 miles from the VOR, the captain finally asked for gear down to be selected. He now had only 2.2 miles to lose almost 2,000 feet in order to reach the glide slope intercept point of 3.2 miles at the correct altitude. The speed was reduced to 190 knots, flaps 20 was selected and the speed brakes were finally retracted. The GPWS, now called out
2500,
showed that the radio altimeter had started sensing the ground below them, and when he heard that, the first officer responded, "Check." But the captain didn't respond, even though the low visibility procedures required him to do that. This was yet another sign that he was now possibly getting task saturated. Now remember we talked before about get-there-itis? Well, this was a prime example of that. The captain was now focusing all of his attention on getting the aircraft down to the glide slope, when the much easier decision would have been to just tell the controller that they were too high, level the aircraft off at the missed approach altitude, and then just fly the missed approach. That would have taken maybe a few minutes extra and been a bit of a hassle for sure, but the aircraft would then have been in a much better position and they could have done a relaxed and perfectly normal ILS after that. They had plenty of fuel, so that wasn't a problem, and they were also the only aircraft in the area. It's exactly in situations like this that the pilot monitoring plays such a super important role in being that voice of calm and sanity, advocating for decisions like this to be made, but that sadly didn't happen.
两杆减压机床垫，掌握关键减压技术，释放全身压力，真的很减压哦。
剥皮辣椒微辣回甘，烘烤锁住鸡汁，肯德基剥皮辣椒纸包鸡。
Instead followed a discussion between the two pilots, which will have very dire consequences. The captain said, "Look, actually you can see the ground down there, likely seeing an opening in the fog below them." The first officer responded, "Well, I'm monitoring the instruments, as he rightfully should be," but to that the captain responded, "Instruments? I monitor the instruments, you look outside." And the first officer responded in agreement to that. Now, I cannot overemphasize how important that discussion was. The captain likely said this because he wanted to get an early indication of any runway or approach lights in sight so he could take a decision to land, but what he was effectively doing was to remove the pilot monitoring from his monitoring role and having him stare out into the dark fog instead. Anyway, the aircraft had now reached a distance of 3.2 miles from the VOR, which is where the glide slope needed to be captured in order for them to continue the approach. But they were still at 4,000 feet, meaning a good 600 feet above the glide slope, and that meant that the glide slope indicator showed full deflection down and likely wasn't even moving. Like I mentioned before, the mandatory checkpoints, like the final approach fix, was supposed to be verbally called out and verified towards the altitude, but that had not been